I started the Real Mental podcast because it bugs me when film and TV miss the mark about how mental health gets portrayed. Real Mental is a podcast where a film loving psychiatrist, that's me, talks to directors, writers, actors, and critics to help people figure out their life by getting to the truth about mental health in the movies. Welcome, Brian Eggert, to the Real Mental podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be back.
Yeah, I'm really happy to have you back, especially for this film, Rental Family, because it was such a cool film. And I really wanted to talk to you especially about it because you're such a film fan and film historian, shall we say. And so I think you can really appreciate it in the context of similar kinds of films as well. So why don't you, before we start, tell the listeners a little bit about who you are, remind them, what you do, and then we'll get started.
Sure. I write for deepfocusreview.com. I've done that since 2007. People can find my reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. Last year, I was nominated the Independent Film Critic of the Year for the U.S., so that is a little feather in my cap. Completely independent. I don't like to work for other people. I like to do what I do and pursue what interests me and write how much I want to write. So I tend to dabble more in critical analysis than typical reviews, and some people like that, some people don't. That's all right. But if you like to read lengthy reviews, that come to deepfocusreview.com.
Right, which is why it's called Deep Focus, I suppose, right?
Right.
Well, that suits the Real Mental podcast because we like to talk in depth about the films and really explore, what they're talking about, what they mean, how they're significant. So I really was interested to hear your perspective on Rental Family starring Brendan Fraser.
Yeah. So I caught this just a couple of days ago, actually, and was a little mixed on it, actually. I've heard about this rent-a-family system in Japan. There was this article in the New Yorker, and I think it was 2018, that kind of exposed it to people for the first time. And then Conan O'Brien went there and kind of did a little bit there, and that was funny. And then Werner Herzog made this documentary in 2020, I think, called Family Romance, LLC, where he explored it. And my exposure to this was that it's a system where if you have an emotional gap in your life, you can hire an actor to fill that. And there is an element of surrogacy, I guess, or people are aware that you're bringing in someone to fill a need. So a widower who, had something to say to their late wife might bring in an actor to say that and have that catharsis, which is a really interesting idea. And what made me kind of frustrated, and it's kind of the point of this whole movie, is that there's this other element of deception involved where people are hiring actors, and some of the people who are having emotional interactions with these actors are not aware that they're actors, and they're forming real bonds and then having to break those bonds, which is fascinating and ripe for drama, but it's so deeply, for me, deeply unethical that I don't know, I wrestled with that a little bit, and I had a lot of questions about why they weren't asking more questions, and so I kind of wrestled with that a bit. I do think that some of the performances were excellent. I think Brendan Fraser has a tendency to be really big and kind of, I don't know, soap opera-y, I guess. He's just a very big actor, like big gestures, big emotions on his faces. I think that's why he's so well suited for kind of the stuff that he did in the 90s, like Encino Man or Dudley Do-Right. He's just these big kind of cartoon actors. And so him compared to the kind of restrained emotions of the kind of stereotype about Japanese culture is that it's emotionally restrained, and so acting is very subtle usually, and so the other actors are very kind of internal and you have to probe a little bit more, and he's very big, and that kind of, I wrestled with that a little bit. So there's a lot we can get into it more, but I kind of wrestled with a lot of these ideas, though I did think that it was a fascinating film that's ripe for discussion. Like, it's the perfect movie to discuss. I was a little worried that there wasn't going to be anything to it and we wouldn't have a lot to talk about, but I think there is a lot to talk about.
Oh, yeah. Well, one of the things I remembered after I saw this movie, I saw it at the Toronto Film Festival. I was thinking about that movie, The Farewell by Lulu Wang.
Yeah.
And you're talking about deception. And that whole movie is based on deception about how there's this grandmother who gets this terminal diagnosis, and the whole family conspires to not tell her about her diagnosis. They say, why should we make her last days unhappy? Let her live and be happy. And the grandmother has no idea. And the one character who's opposed to this deception, of course, is the American. This is a Chinese family in China. She goes to visit her grandma and she's outraged at the deception. She thinks it's entirely unethical and thinks that it's horrendous to deprive her grandmother of the opportunity to say her goodbyes and get her affairs in order. She thinks it's awful. She's coming from the American perspective, and her perspective is this is terrible. The Asian perspective, or the Chinese perspective in this case, is that it's the right thing to do, and it would be horrible to cause grandma harm by telling her this bad news. So what you're really seeing is this huge culture clash about, what is the right thing to do, and in which cases is deception ethical and in which cases it's unethical, and so much of it is culturally based, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that Rental Family shows a very similar conundrum. And in fact, the American character, Brendan Fraser, he had a big problem at the very beginning. Like, he didn't want to go through with his first job because he really was torn. And it was only because his client was so upset and he realized that he would be doing her more harm by backing out than by doing it and deceiving her whole family. And so he went and did it. And then he started rationalizing it because, of his own needs, right? His need for an income, his need for community, his need for meaning in his life, to do something. And so he starts rationalizing it. But in their society, there appears to have been quite a lot of people who were perfectly okay, like this mother who was perfectly okay with deceiving her child. These people seem to be fine. A daughter deceiving her elderly father, they seemed okay. And having watched The Farewell, it's believable to me that in certain cultures, this kind of deception is acceptable on some level to some people, not to our North American palates at all. Right. And in The Farewell, it was very clear because the one American family member, Billy, played by Awkwafina, she was like, no way, this is wrong. She was determined to, right this wrong till almost the very end. But in Rental Family, I don't think there's as much of that contrast, but I think the contrast exists. And we're really seeing this, North American versus Japanese in this case, idea of what's okay, what's ethical. Does the end justify the means?
I think it's interesting that both kind of take the North American perspective. They're both, I guess, Awkwafina and Brendan Fraser, they're both Americans looking at similar situations. And there's a little bit of, I kind of got a sense of like othering, as we're watching it, like we as North Americans should be kind of judging this as North Americans. And I don't know of a movie that is fully from the Japanese perspective or dealing with, the issue of in The Farewell of that deception fully from the Chinese perspective. Maybe I just need to watch more, Chinese and Japanese cinema. I thought I was pretty well viewed, but apparently not. But I would love to see a drama from that perspective and not so judgmental and just kind of see how it works and see it working. And you kind of see that here, but the movie's always raising these questions about, is this right or is this wrong? And, I did some minor research and there's no laws against this. There's no laws against the deception. I mean, this is all perfectly legal. There have been certain situations where things have gone too far and, maybe a crime was committed or something, but, this is perfectly acceptable. And I would love to just see how that works. I could see like a TV series or something like that about situations where this is all working. And in fact, Rental Family, I think, could be like a TV series or something. It's very episodic anyway. He's dealing with, a mother who needs her daughter to get into a school, so she needs him to pretend to be her husband, and that's kind of where the biggest emotional connection forms was between this girl who thinks that she's his dad, and he has to play her dad, and they have to form a real father-daughter bond. And then there's another situation where an aged actor, he, doesn't feel like there's enough attention on him anymore. And his daughter hires Brendan Fraser to play a film journalist and do an interview with him. And in both cases, you have to wonder, when they're hiring these people, they're not necessarily thinking about, Brendan Fraser is an actor who is well known from this toothpaste commercial that's playing around Japan, and everybody like looks at him and kind of recognizes him and they're not quite sure. Then they realize, oh, it's the toothpaste guy. And no one ever asked up front, is someone going to recognize that this is the toothpaste guy? Or if I'm supposed to be writing this article for this aged actor and the article never comes out, isn't this aged actor gonna realize that this was all a sham? There were questions like that where the setup just maybe didn't make sense to me.
It made sense to me because the girl, I think she plays like a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, something
Yeah,
like
I think
that.
she's 11. Yeah.
And his commercial was actually like 6 or 7 years ago. It was
Oh,
supposed
sure.
to have been 6 or 7 years in the past. So she would have been very little. So she wouldn't have seen the commercial. And the commercial wasn't still playing, actually. It played in the past. And
Sure.
so he's kind of formerly famous. So a few people would
Yeah.
know him, but he's not a famous guy, actually. Otherwise, they wouldn't have hired him. So I think that he has enough anonymity that most people wouldn't know him. And the old guy, we missed one important point, which is that he's in the early stages of dementia or middle
Sure.
stages
Yeah.
of dementia. Also, he's a very famous, serious actor who maybe wouldn't be aware of a toothpaste commercial guy, right?
Right. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think in both cases, the daughter and the older guy, there would be good reasons why they wouldn't have seen the commercial. And especially since it was popular 6 or 7 years ago when she was maybe 5 or something, or 4.
Yeah.
And the older man, his memory is not so great anyway. So I think they can get away with that. I think the more interesting question for me is, how does this individual, like Brendan Fraser, his character, how does he get himself into this situation, right? And I think that's the piece that to me was so compelling, because he goes to Japan because clearly he's not making it in the United States, right? He's an actor, but it's not working. He gets this big commercial gig. It gives him a lot of money and a little bit of fame for a short period of time. And then he decides to stay, thinking that now he's got, some fame and he's going to have a career, and things go nowhere, right? Probably because he's a big American guy with a lot of energy, and it just isn't a good fit, right? It was great for this commercial, but not for typical things in Japan. And so he's languishing. And also, he's really, really lonely, right? His only connections are the people he, engages with in terms of, shopkeepers and things like that, and a woman who, is not really his girlfriend. So, right? So
Yeah.
he's a lonely guy. And so how does he get himself into this situation?
Yeah, I actually really liked the relationship between him and the sex worker that he's seeing. I thought these kind of transactional relationships, whether it's a sex worker or someone who is, hired by a rental family, or even it made me think of just movies in general. Like these are all kind of artificial relationships that we have, and yet they're producing real emotions. And that aspect to me was really fascinating because, you watch a movie and you feel all the emotions and you cry and everything, and you feel like you have a relationship with these people. And just because it's, staged doesn't mean that those emotions are not genuine. And I think the same thing is playing out here in a fascinating way. And I can see how this would be therapeutic, and how, it's like drama therapy. You go to therapy and you're supposed to maybe act out or write a play or something like that that's dealing with your trauma or whatever. And there is a real catharsis at the end of that. And I think that is just kind of what's going on here. And it's a really, yeah, really fascinating. Even as we're talking about it, I'm starting to like this or appreciate this movie more. But good thing I haven't posted my review yet, so I might just like write around it a little bit and make it a little bit more positive. But yeah, I love that idea that these artificial relationships lead to real feelings.
And he gets into this relationship with a sex worker. And interestingly, the way the film portrays it, he's in bed with her, they're hanging out, and we think it's his girlfriend. And then there's the exchange of money, and we realize, oh, it's transactional. But if he is so already used to having this, it seems like a long-term transactional interaction with this sex worker.
Yeah.
If he's used to having this transactional interaction all this time, and it was very satisfying to him, you can see how easily he could slide into doing rental family work, because he's been on the receiving end and it's worked for him. It's been a lifeline for him. He really is lonely, and she's the only person who really makes him feel comforted. And their relationship isn't only transactional. She feels kindly toward him. And
Mm-hmm.
you see it later on in the film where they bump into each other and she's kind to him, right? So she's not just in a transactional relationship with him. That's their primary relationship, but she also has some warmth toward him. And so if he can see that the person who is pretending to be his girlfriend can also give him something, then why couldn't he give something to these people when he's pretending to be their father, their journalist, their friend, their mourner, their, groom, whatever, right? So I think that it very subtly, the film very subtly shows us that, as you said, even though these relationships aren't quote unquote real, we do have real feelings. And the people who are experiencing Brendan Fraser's character are getting something out of it. It's just when it gets a little too complicated and harm can be done that the problems arise. And then, that's other food for thought.
Yeah, yeah. And they do make a distinction kind of by the end that we're going to do these types of roles and not these potentially dangerous types of roles, both physically and certain emotional situations. It seems like they're not going to do that anymore. And they're really going to just kind of vet out these assignments a little bit better. So there's not risk to, the actor who's doing it and the people that they're performing for. So yeah, I like that resolution at the end. Maybe we should talk about the filmmaking. So this is directed by Hikari, who is a two-time filmmaker. She made another film on Netflix, which I haven't seen, 37 Seconds. I don't know if you've seen it.
No.
I think it's just kind of lost in the servers of Netflix, so I'll have to go find that. But I thought it was kind of, like I said, a little bit soap opera in how it was presented. Lots of big music, sentimental music to kind of accent every emotion. And that is maybe where I started to feel like the drama was a little bit cloying, maybe because of the way that it was shot. And it was shot kind of like a TV show and just didn't have a lot cinematically going on. We have talked in the past about very cinematic movies, you and I, Pedro Almodovar and Mike Lee. And this just feels like kind of a, shot on digital and lots of drone shots and that sort of thing. And I would have preferred maybe something a little bit more, I don't know, earthy, I guess, or just real, but maybe then that digital quality is saying something about how these are artificial relationships and there is a gloss behind it and it is drama, but those emotions are genuine. So I think I just talked myself into liking it again.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. It's provocative. It's provocative in a very subtle way because it sort of annoys you and then it makes you think. And then it makes you think and then you kind of like it for annoying you and making you think. And I wanted to say also that Brendan Fraser's character also got involved. Like he got emotionally involved in almost all of the situations where he was pretending to be something. He got emotionally touched and sometimes he was hurt and sometimes he was helped and it had a powerful effect on him. And in fact, his Japanese colleagues were also experiencing a lot of emotions doing their jobs. So it's not just the people on the receiving end of the rental family members who are having strong reactions. The actors were having emotions as well. And they were kind of joining together with Brendan Fraser's character and going like, we need to change how we do this role to protect ourselves as well. But I want to get back to what you said about the kind of technicolor aspect of this film. The last kind of a Japanese film, it was the Wim Wenders film, Perfect Days. So it was set in Japan with Japanese actors, but made by a German director. So I don't know if I can call it a Japanese film, but it was set in Japan with Japanese actors. And it was cinematically gorgeous. It was shot with such subtlety and such earthiness and depth and beauty and soul. And then I compare that to this one, which looks like almost like a live action cartoon. But I think that was a very deliberate choice because it was so over the top, OTT. It was so technicolor. It was so flowers and balloons and bubbles. It was so beautiful and colorful. And even the way he dressed, it was so cartoony, like TV. I have to think that this was a very deliberate choice to emphasize the dichotomy between artifice and truth and what is real and what is fake, because the reality is all the people in the film had real feelings. As much as they were doing all this fakery, the feelings were all very real, very profound. And, people got hurt, people got mad, people got upset, people almost went to jail for certain things, So there were stakes. So for all of the falseness and the colors and the prettiness and the, it was very real. And I think what Hikari was doing, maybe I'm giving her more credit than she deserves, but I think it was deliberate. I think she was really having a treatise almost on what is real, what is fake, and, does it matter in the grand scheme of things? Because we're all engaged, like you said. You said yourself at the very beginning, we're all feeling it. We can't help but feel when we interact in those ways. We can't help but get engaged, even if we're the one doing the pretending. Do you remember Heath Ledger when he was playing the Joker afterwards? He said that it had this very profound negative effect on him.
Yeah,
It really caused him harm to play that character. And, so actors can be hurt by inhabiting these characters and playing these roles. So I think this film is a treatise on what's real, what's fake, and how it doesn't really matter because we're all having the feelings, and that we need to understand that even when we're pretending, they call it fake it till you make it. We have to understand that we're feeling things. The feelings are real. The feelings
Yeah.
are always real. And now let's pause for a quick word about my other podcast. I'm Dr. Marcia Sirota. We all need to be inspired and uplifted these days. We need a good laugh and we need to be moved. In the Ruthless Compassion podcast, I speak with a wonderfully diverse group of people. They've overcome daunting obstacles and they're making unique, exciting contributions to our communities and to our world. The Ruthless Compassion podcast has created more than 175 episodes over the past several years. Why not have a listen to it today?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think Hikari's intentionality with the form, I wrestle with that. Like, I could see it being like, because some of it is, just the parades that are going on. And I mean, that's just what Japanese culture is like. And I don't know if she's framing that to be this colorful, artificial world. And maybe, some of it is because a lot of it is about behaving in a certain way that meets the social expectation. And so maybe this is a comment on Japanese society, that there is a certain level of artifice involved and you need to act in a certain way. And I mean, that's true in North America as well. I mean, you have to act a certain way, and it's different ways, obviously, than Japan, but there is a certain level of artifice wherever you go. We all wear masks, and the mask in Japan is just a little bit different. And so I can see that kind of her underscoring those elements in Japanese society. I maybe would have wanted just a little bit more like heightened stylization, I guess, beyond what it already is to really drive home the point, but maybe I'm asking for a lack of subtlety in style or something like that. But yeah, I see your point, and for the most part agree with you that this is an intentional choice, and a clever one, a subtle one, and so subtle to the point where I was kind of like, I don't know how intentional this is, or if it's just bad filmmaking. And I think when you can, at least for me, when I couldn't really tell like if the style was underlined intentionally or if it was just kind of like, does this look bad? Is this just incompetence or is this intentional? And I think it is probably intentional, but I did have that doubt while I was watching it.
Yeah, I totally get it because, well, first of all, it's her second film and really her first film that's come to any attention. And I think, she may be a little inexperienced. And so some of these stylistic choices might have been finessed better. But I think, nevertheless, the ideas are so interesting. And what you said about persona, I really loved because we all have a persona. When I go to work, I'm in my psychiatrist persona, right? And that's very different than my podcasting persona, right? Which is also different from my personal life persona. So, we do wear different hats or different masks, and it's appropriate. You don't want me to be talking to you like, I'm your psychiatrist. It's not appropriate, right? And, certainly not with my personal life people, right? And on the other hand, I'm not going to be like cash with my patients or the people I do assessments on. So we have to have these personas because they help us understand our roles in society, and they actually keep people safe. Those boundaries keep people safe, right? So in the case of Japan, they have different rules and different roles. And for the same reason, I'm sure, to keep society safe and healthy and to keep people safe and healthy. And how they formulated those rules and those roles, that's up to them. Who are we to judge? And how we do it is our way, and who are they to judge? But it's an interesting comparison, I think. What persona, they might have there versus what persona we might have here. And I think what the filmmaker is saying is, we can't judge, right? We can observe and find it interesting that it's different, but we can't judge because every society has rules and roles and personas.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think this is a really fascinating film for all those reasons. I feel like a lot of the subtlety and kind of the dynamics that we're talking about might be, at least in some of the reviews that I've read, other reviews that I've read, might be missed for just kind of the emotional and kind of judgmental aspects of it. I feel like a lot of what I've read about this is kind of judging this practice rather than trying to understand it. And also just seeing how often we do this ourselves, maybe not through transactional ways, but through other ways where we're performing or trying to fulfill a need, whether it's, I'm feeling sad, so I'm going to watch a happy movie, or I'm feeling sad, so I'm going to watch a sad movie so I can kind of work through that. I think it's all kind of in the same ballpark and more relatable than it may seem initially.
Yeah, and what you said just now about how we play a role, for someone else, how much do we go into like a romantic relationship and think we have to be a certain way to please the other person? And we're really not being genuine, but we think that they won't want us unless we are a certain way. And so yes, of course, I love basketball. Let's watch basketball, 3 times a week together. Meanwhile, you hate basketball, but you think your partner wants you to love basketball with them. Or, sure, I adore camping. Let's go camping. Meanwhile, lying on the cold, hard ground in a sleeping bag is like the worst possible thing in your life. But off you go camping, right? And so you're not being genuine, right? Or I'm always cheerful. Ha ha ha. I'm such a cheerful person. That's my persona. But, maybe you have some sadness and you're never showing the person who you are. So there are stakes to trying too hard to be the thing that the other person wants. And I think this film is also talking about that because Brendan Fraser's character, there were stakes to being this person, right? And he couldn't keep it up. Like he had to change the way he interacted even though he was breaking the rules, because he had to be more himself than the character, because if he had stayed the character, it would have caused him harm and the other people harm. So I think it's also talking about, as you say, when we are trying to be this persona or play this role in order to please the other person because we think that's how we need to interact, it doesn't work for either of us. They don't get the real us, and so it's not real intimacy, and we can't be loved for who we are. So I think it's a really interesting exploration of, personas, truth, artifice, relationships. Unfortunately, I think it's really deep and really interesting, but I think you're right. Unfortunately, people maybe are missing, but also, a lot of people don't think about things too deeply these days. And,
That's true.
a lot of people just look at the surface and it's pretty and it's colorful and this thing is happening that we don't agree with in North America. And of course, North Americans are so self-focused, our way is the way. So between, the difficulty appreciating other perspectives and the tendency towards superficiality, I think this film might get lost in the shuffle. But I think that it's much more deep and much more fascinating than what it's maybe being portrayed to be.
Yeah, I agree. I found it really relatable actually as a Minnesotan. Minnesota has there's a thing called Minnesota Nice, which I don't know if you've heard, but it's
No.
we're very, I don't know if it's a Scandinavian, mindset or whatever, but it's this reserved emotions where you always put on a happy face and you don't express, if you're feeling sad, you don't talk about that. And that's definitely, like, I grew up in a house like that, and so those kind of emotions or just expressing oneself is not typical for our culture here, and some people kind of rebel against that. But I found it relatable, and often find Japanese films relatable because there is so much reserved and so much, you're not supposed to talk about certain things, and you're very internal. And so I do find that relatable, and that's one reason that I kind of yearn for this drama, this speculative drama that's in my head about this rental family type thing, but from a Japanese perspective, to kind of understand all of that and not from the North American mindset. Even so, I think that this movie is probably going to expose a lot of people to this practice, and I don't know, hopefully they can kind of see the value in these kind of transactional relationships and relate it to their own life in some way.
Well, it starts with an interaction with a sex worker, right?
Yeah.
Which is extremely positive. There's absolutely no judgment about that relationship.
Right.
And that's, the oldest profession and the oldest transactional profession known to humankind. And she's saying, look how much value Brendan Fraser's character gets from his transactional relationship, long-term transactional relationship with this sex worker. Look how much it gives him and how close they are on a certain level, even though she's a professional friend. They still have a connection. It's hard not to. It's like I have connections with my patients who I've been working with for many years. They're not my friends, they're not my family, but we have a connection. It's a professional relationship, but there's warmth, there's a connection. So relationships that involve, people paying for a service can still be real relationships and can still involve warmth and caring and can be a very positive thing. And I think she's kind of trying to turn things on their head, the filmmaker, right, Hikari? I think she's trying to say, don't judge transactional relationships as harshly, perhaps, as you might, because, they're not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, your profession is a perfect example of that. It's a known profession for working through your emotions. So how is that any different than hiring an actor or hiring a sex worker or as I said before, watching a movie to work kind of through your emotions? I think these are all valid ways of achieving something, that a genuine emotion or a genuine feeling that is valid at the end of the day. So yeah, I think this kind of opens the door to all sorts of other transactional relationships in a fascinating way.
I never thought I would be comparing my profession to being a sex worker, but
Sure.
not in a million
It's all
years.
the same. It's all the same stuff. Don't worry about it. Yeah.
But I brought it up, so there you go. But really, I'm talking about relationships which are not personal per se. They're professional relationships of different types, obviously, but professional relationships can still be positive relationships and can be extremely positive relationships in some cases. If we do it right? Like the sex worker was doing it right in this movie.
Yeah.
She had really good boundaries, but she also had warmth. And I think in the same thing you have to have in psychotherapy. You have to have really good boundaries and have warmth. And I think with Brendan Fraser in his role as well, he had to have really good boundaries as a rental family person and have warmth. And sometimes because of the kinds of roles he was asked to play, the warmth kind of superseded the boundaries, but that was only because it was, I think, pushing it too far in certain kinds of roles that he was hired to do. And that's why they had to make an adjustment at the end. Maybe these roles aren't appropriate because they're too high risk, but I think it's showing us that, we can have different kinds of relationships that are meaningful and satisfying. And there's not just one kind of relationship that's okay. And I think in North America, we have very rigid ideas of what kind of relationships are okay. Certainly the relationship Brendan Fraser has with the sex worker would not be considered acceptable in many areas of North America. But, I think the filmmaker is saying there are a lot of different kinds of relationships that could be very positive if we let go of our preconceived notions of what's okay.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, this is a fascinating film that I think has more layers than it might seem as we're talking about it. So yeah, I think I need to go back and kind of rethink my review, actually. I'm glad I didn't post it.
Well, that's a positive result of our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Brian Eggert, thank you so much for coming on the Real Mental podcast today to talk about Rental Family starring Brendan Fraser. It's really been fun chatting with you.
Thanks for having me back. This was a joy.
This is Dr. Marcia Sirota. Thanks for listening to the Real Mental podcast. Please leave a review and your comments wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for my free newsletter at marciasirotamd.com. And while you're at it, why not check out my Ruthless Compassion podcast with over 180 episodes and counting. If you have any ideas for guests for either Real Mental or Ruthless Compassion podcasts, please email us at info@marciasirotamd.com. Happy listening.